Star Wars canon and Legends have taken divergent approaches to capital ship development. Canon has uniformly shown drastic increases in ship sizes from both the New Republic and the First Order. The Resurgent Battlecruiser, for example, is over 80% larger than the ISD, while the New Republic ships recovered by the Resistance are larger than those used by the Alliance. The First Order also introduced the mammoth Mega Star Destroyer, which eclipses any ship which came before it. On the other hand, with a few niche exceptions, Legends vessels never surpassed the Executor class Super Star Destroyer in length, while the mainline capital ships of each faction slightly decreased in size over time. This is most evident in the late Legacy era, where dreadnoughts fell out of use completely. However, the trend is noticeable even if we look at the first 40 years or so after the Battle of Endor. The Empire, with perhaps some Dark Empire exceptions, introduced very few, if any, new battlecruiser or dreadnought models after the death of Palpatine. The New Republic, which arguably created a more stable government than the Empire, even while facing more existential threats, created significantly less large ships, perhaps a handful or two of Rata size or above. We're mainly talking about the Mediators, Viscounts, and Stridents, and if we include the Galactic Alliance, perhaps some of their heavy carriers. But it's more than that. The most powerful vessels of the New Republic, and thus the galaxy, were small. The New Class Modernization Program and the spectacular Nebula Star Destroyer were just a smidge over a kilometer in length, while the MC-90, the first purpose-built Mon Calamari warship, was generally smaller than the Home One, which preceded it. The Imperial Remnant, as we discussed a couple of days ago, also introduced their own smaller warship, the Turbulent. But why this trend towards downsizing? We'll get to that in just a second, but first, I am very grateful to have today's video kindly sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with more than 25,000 classes in design, business, and more. Premium memberships give you unlimited access, so you can join the classes and community that are right for you and your goals. Skillshare is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to the first 500 people who click the link in the description box. And even if you miss that, it's only $10 a month anyway. Personally, I wish that I had access to video editing with Adobe Premiere Pro for beginners when I started my YouTube channel. And I'm hoping that now I can further my skills with one of the many Photoshop classes. So if you want to join groups to learn with like-minded learners, give and receive feedback on projects, and speak to those with the same interests as you, consider checking out Skillshare. Again, links for a free trial down in the description, and you'll be helping me out too. Anyway, back to the Star Wars lore. So I think by this point we've clearly established that there was a clear shift towards smaller ships after Endor, and as I alluded to earlier, the most powerful Legacy era vessel was the Imperius, which was likely smaller than every Imperial battlecruiser. Let's look at the why, and one of the most important aspects has to be the death of the Tarkin Doctrine. As I'm sure most of you know, the Tarkin Doctrine stated that control of the galaxy was only possible if the ruling government had overwhelming power, ruling through fear. This led to the creation of Super Star Destroyers and the Death Star. The New Republic, a democratic government, had voluntary membership and thus kept systems in line through diplomacy. What's more, there were alternatives within the galaxy. If you didn't want to join the New Republic, the Imperial Remnant existed, as did several other smaller coalitions or just independents. For that reason, the military was used primarily to counter external threats, and was thus focused on practicality rather than psychological warfare. And when it comes down to it, Super Star Destroyers, dreadnoughts, and ships significantly larger than ISDs don't seem to be very practical. The Viscount line, for example, was produced primarily to counter existing dreadnoughts, and by the time of the Yuuzhan Vong War, was nearly cancelled because of its presumed lack of utility. It's true that dreadnoughts are incredibly powerful and unique vessels in Total War, but as we learn in the Legacy era RPG guide, the costs of Super Star Destroyers, by about 130 ABY were too burdensome for governments to handle, and in most situations they were too inflexible to be used practically. So the same resources for a dreadnought can be used to create several smaller vessels which can combine their power when needed, but also be used diversely across space. Canon Thrawn actually addresses this point, albeit in reference to the Death Star. Here's the quote: "But I would also warn against diverting too many of the Empire's resources from a flexible navy of capital ships and starfighters to massive projects that can bring the Imperial presence to only one system at a time." Palpatine responds to this by saying that once the Death Star is fully operational, its mere existence will suppress all opposition. However, without the Tarkin doctrine, even this flimsy explanation is no longer valid. The New Republic's philosophy on this point can be seen in the creation of the New Class project. Kraken's threat dossier explains that unlike the Imperial Navy, New Republic warships were not seen as mobile bases. They had less focus on carrying assets for a ground invasion or operating independently for a long period of time. New Republic ships were a part of a larger designated fleet. They had a specific purpose and were usually accompanied by fleet tenders and other ships carrying resources. What's more, the general increases in technology also allowed ships that were only 65% of an ISD's size to match its firepower. So we already have many reasons which explain why the New Republic and later factions focused on smaller ships. However, at this point, I do want to reiterate that large ships do have a niche in which they can be effective. What we're examining is trends, and we have to assume that the military scientists of the various Star Wars eras did not operate perfectly. For example, the Essential Guide to Warfare specifically notes that although New Republic strategists assume that the New Class project and its smaller ships could handle any issue, the Black Fleet Crisis, the Orinda campaign, the Vong War, and the Dark Empire invasion showed that larger designs were not totally outdated and that there was still a need for dreadnoughts. So at this point in galactic history, we have almost the inverse of mutually assured destruction. The failure to build dreadnoughts allows the reliance on smaller ships throughout the galaxy. However, if one faction had a dreadnought or Super Star Destroyer, the balance is shifted drastically. However, the main limiter isn't psychological or related to war theory. Rather, it was, in my opinion, related to the practicality of massive starship construction. As we saw with the Viscount before the Yuuzhan Vong War, there are extreme political pressures associated with creating very large ships. And even Palpatine was not immune to these pressures. But this is especially true for the New Republic, which sought to differentiate itself from the Empire and its massive tools of war. There were also serious economic considerations. The costs to construct a Super Star Destroyer were extreme and represented a serious opportunity cost. You're basically trading dozens of small ships for one very large one. What's more, the Empire had an almost unique situation in that it had totally nationalized most aspects associated with military ship production, from the shipyards itself to financing and banking. The Empire had total control of the galaxy such that it could justify building dozens of dreadnoughts, because it could afford to do so. Post-Endor factions were fighting a much more even galactic war. There was a strict need for practicality, while the megalomania associated with Palpatine ships or the Ruusan Reformation era show ships of the Kuwati fell generally to the wayside. However, it wasn't just a decline of the dreadnoughts, but as we've discussed, the continued focus on practicality above all else extended even to Star Destroyer classes. Ships became increasingly specialized as well, and by 130 ABY, the Galactic Alliance used what was essentially a capital ship-sized starfighter in the Scythe class, which was only really effective in a very niche situation, when the enemy was directly in front of it, and the ship could be supported by smaller vessels. The New Republic focused on creating ships which could operate effectively at extreme ranges, and which could use their small size and maneuverability to fire at enemy ships while staying out of the attack range of their enemy. And a good example of this is the 700-meter long Majestic Cruiser, which could engage and destroy a Star Destroyer despite being less than half of its size. Another factor is starfighters, and the Empire was actually an anomaly in how it used fighters. Generally, the trend after Endor was was to use powerful, effective starfighters to carry a significant portion of the offensive burden, lessening the need for hulking weapons platforms. Almost every New Republic and Galactic Alliance vessel had significant carrying capacity, and some of the most renowned vessels in galactic history, including the Nebula and the Galactic class, could accurately be described as self-sufficient carriers. So to summarize, I think there are a few reasons for the downsizing of Star Wars ships. I think the greatest factors are the death of Palpatine, the focus on cost effectiveness and practicality in shipbuilding, the specialization of capital ships, and the creation of more flexible navies, and finally, the economic realities associated with a non-imperialized galaxy. However, all of that is my opinion. Is what I'm saying making sense? Am I correct in identifying this trend towards smaller capital ships? Make sure to let me know all of that and more down in the description. No hashtag Ask Eck question of the day, but if you have a brief question you'd like me to address at the end of my videos, leave it down below with the hashtag Ask Eck. As always guys, I hope you had a great day. I hope you have a great week. Be safe and may the Force be with you.